Hey everyone, welcome to the second section of the bonus podcasting section of Doing Content Right. So, this second section is all about your podcast monopoly, which is a very similar, if not identical, concept to the personal monopoly that we talked about in the main book. But the difference here is how it relates to audio and how do you stand out in a sea of 1 million podcasts and many more to come. All right, so we come to some of the same concepts that we talked about in DCR, where attention is not returned linearly. And effectively, anything that is democratized by the internet, only the best of the best wins. One quick caveat there is that with podcasts, as I talked about, the ecosystem is not fully developed. And because of that, we don't have the perfect distribution mechanisms. And so the absolute best stuff may not be at the top yet, but it will be eventually. And so many of the same concepts still apply here. They just may not be fully in effect today. Therefore, if this is true, we still must be tangibly better in some specific area that people care about if our podcast is going to succeed. So, if you remember, this is a slide directly from the original DCR set of live sessions, and it's this idea that saturation is not the number of people in a space that matters, but the likelihood that you can out innovate what already exists. And we talked about several examples where it's actually better to be in a space where there isn't something necessarily great and you can actually think of something either completely new or better than what already exists out there. So we're going to move on. We're not going to dwell too much on this, but if you remember, as I was going through the concept in the original section of DCR, the question became, okay, so I need to be better in some way, either new or better. And if we're focusing on better, because many podcasts already exist, and we've talked, there's a million already that exist today and many more to be developed, well, then what does better mean? We talked in the original book about better meaning anything from funnier to more concise, more punchy, more thoughtful, more contrarian. There's endless adjectives that you can apply to written content, and the same thing is true with audio content. So in fact, I just took a Quora, I just Googled what is your favorite podcast and why? And I found a Quora post. And from that Quora post, I pulled out descriptions of people's favorite podcasts. And you can see that the general idea here is very much the same as before. So people would say things like, there was a delightful commentator, or it's the most informed, educated, and prepared interviewer I've ever heard. It's filled with intelligent and intense debates and discussions on well-researched topics. There's many, many other quotes here, but the idea is you can go through the same exercise and think through, why does someone choose to listen to a podcast versus another one? If you remember from the prior session, people only listen to, on average, 6 or so podcasts in total. And so how do you even enter that person's 6? It's very difficult, and you must be tangibly better. And you can parse how someone's better into simple adjectives, and you can see they very much mimic the adjectives mapped out in written content. So things can be more enjoyable, unfiltered, intelligent, prepared, inquisitive, unbiased. And so we're really getting back to the same concept that we talked about in the first session, which is that these forms of content, whether it's a blog or a newsletter or podcast, are just ways to communicate ideas. And since everyone uses similar tools, then it's really what you do with the tool that needs to be differentiated. So, one thing that I encourage you to do if you are thinking of starting a podcast, and we'll talk about more new stuff very soon, I promise, is to go through the first exercise of doing content right, but do this for podcasts. And this exercise, if you don't remember, is going through, and we did this for newsletters or blog sites, but you can do this with podcasts where basically you identify your favorite podcasts and describe them in one sentence, and then take that description and parse it into an adjective. Figure out what you really like about these podcasts. Now, you can do the same thing with something that maybe you listened to once and you thought, I really don't like this podcast. Or maybe you got 15 minutes in and you said, I'm bored, or I really don't like how this person talks, quite frankly, right? There's different reasons why you don't like a podcast. The same way there are reasons that you don't like reading a particular written piece of content. Now, one thing that I really wanted to call out here is I truly think we are earlier on in the evolution of podcasts. And the reason I'm calling this out once again is as you go through this, you may see a trend in the types of podcasts that you like. And that's okay. But one thing to keep in mind is that I think we're actually going to see a new or many new types of podcasts that don't exist today. And we're going to talk about the formats very soon, but just keep this in mind that if you're seeing a lot of common threads of the things that you like, definitely digest that and internalize that. But also keep in mind that I think there's a world of content out there that will emerge with time. If you think through the way written content was 30 years ago, there was only a few formats that people engaged with. And now today, if you think about the world of newsletters that exist out there today, it's just evolved, and there are so many things that didn't exist before. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you are going to start a podcast, this is some of the new content outside of the existing DCR exercises. First, ask yourself this very simple question of why you're even starting a podcast. Now, the reason this is important is, again, I mentioned this in the first session, I tend to see that people start podcasts or newsletters or whatever format of content because they see other people doing it instead of thinking through, what am I trying to achieve here and why am I choosing this medium to achieve that goal? So, for example, you may be thinking, I'm really struggling to convey a concept or an idea in a different medium, and I'd like to convey it with a podcast. You may say, I think this is my route to building up a personal brand. It might be that I already have several content products, but I'd like to increase my MRR. I already have a professional network, but I'd like to grow it. I'd like to teach people about a particular skill. I actually just want to have fun. There's so many examples on this page and many more that you may be trying to achieve with your podcast. But please take a minute and write out a very clear thesis of what you're actually trying to achieve and why a podcast will actually help you achieve that goal. Now, of course, there are many reasons why you do anything, right? You may look at this page and you actually may say, hey, Steph, it's all of the above. But one really important thing here is that with anything that you do, you should have a clear primary goal. And so go through these things and identify what your primary goal is, as I do think that that will end up impacting many of your decisions further along. The other thing I wanted to call out here is that, again, every medium has different pros and cons. And we talked about some of those pros and cons in the prior session. Now, some of these, this is a little arbitrary, but I wanted to talk through some of them, are actually harder to do with a podcast. I'm not trying to, disincentivize people to start a podcast, but just keep in mind, for example, if you are trying to, for example, teach people particular skills, well, some of those skills are quite hard to teach on a podcast. And on top of that, people aren't perhaps used to learning certain things on podcasts. Perhaps if you're trying to generate more top of the funnel traffic for existing products, well, as we talked about, the distribution mechanisms, if you don't already have top of the funnel traffic, it's hard to actually generate that with a podcast, and often harder than if you were to try to do that with another type of medium. And so I've highlighted a couple here where I think actually in trying to start a podcast, it will be harder to achieve that particular goal than perhaps if you were to try to achieve that through another medium. To quickly go through the other two, even though there's a lot of runway for podcasting and monetizing podcasts, often people aren't used to paying for podcasts, and actually the time span between you actually having a significant increase in MRR from a podcast is likely going to be longer than something else. And then if you're trying to get more bang for your buck with existing content, well, sure, you can recreate that content into a podcast, but you can also recreate it in many different ways. You can create visuals, you can create videos, and some of those things may actually help you grow more effectively than a podcast. So again, nothing against podcasts. I think they're excellent. I'm excited about them and hope to start one myself. But write down what you are actually trying to achieve, and keep in mind that some of those goals may actually be more difficult to actually achieve with audio, and just keep that in mind. All right. If you do decide, you know what, Steph, yes, I want to create a podcast, great. The next thing that you want to do is likely think about format. So if we try to compare different types of mediums, as we'll do consistently throughout this chapter, let's start with video, or let's think about video and think about the many different types of content that already exist today with video. So you have, if you're thinking about YouTube, you have people who do vlogs, documentaries, tutorials, product reviews, interviews, conversations, and many, many more forms of content. If you think through audio, and the typical types of audio that we engage with today, only a couple of these actually show up, right? So it's very rare that you actually see someone kind of going throughout their day instead of a vlog. I don't know how you mesh blog and audio, but you don't have that, right? You don't tend to have tutorials. You don't tend to have product reviews. What you do tend to have is kind of the equivalent of something like a documentary. And then the very, very common types of podcast formats are interviews and conversations. And you can see that down here, where interviews tend to be or seem to be the largest section. And then conversational podcasts are the second largest. And one of the things I just wanted to call out here is I think one of the reasons that this is true is because interviews and conversations were very similar to, I guess, what you would say in a more initial form of podcasting was, which was radio. So on a radio show, you don't have any editing, and the easiest way to create live content is through something like an interview or a conversation. And I think you started to see as more evergreen content, like podcasting, came to be, you saw those same types of formats translate over. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because just because most podcasts today are interviews and conversations does not mean that those are the best types of formats to actually engage with. And in fact, I think that the reason those are the most prominent is simply because they are the lowest barrier to entry. But anything that's the lowest barrier to entry tends to mean it's the most competitive. So just keep that in mind as you are thinking through formats. As you are thinking through not just the format, but what you are looking to create, you want to likely go through a similar exercise that we went through in doing content right. This what for who, but you're going to tack on one more thing. And I wasn't sure exactly what term to use for this, but I added when. And what I mean by this is the what for who captures what are you actually trying to translate or provide and for who. But this when aspect is what are they doing? And this kind of relates to this passive listening concept that we talked through in the first session, which is really unique to podcasting. And so the reason that I think this is important is you can kind of empathize through your audience and how they'll engage with this content. How will your audience actually listen to this? What will they be doing? And I added a couple examples here that I made up, right? So these weren't actually released by these companies, but it gives you a sense of what I mean by this. So Robinhood Snacks, for example. Robinhood Snacks is your daily dose of financial news for millennials, but the when is when they're on the move. Robinhood Snacks is a very short podcast. It's, I think, something like 10 to 15 minutes each day. And so these are for people probably commuting, people moving around on their way to work, not someone who's sitting and cleaning the house for 4 hours and looking for a long podcast. So that's something that helps you, again, think through who your audience is, what they're looking for, and how your podcast fits into their life. My First Million is the Hustle podcast. And this is my description of it, but it's business ideas for business builders taking a break from their busy days. So My First Million is more entertaining, I would say. Well, Robinhood Snacks is also entertaining, but it's longer. And it's really for busy people who don't have the time to riff on business ideas throughout their day and who, can sit down and think through new businesses every weekend necessarily. But these busy people really enjoy this hour, right, in between their day where they can listen to two people riff on really exciting new business ideas. And you even have, if you've heard people talk about My First Million, sometimes it's very, very successful people like investors or people already running companies who are like, you know what, I love My First Million because I want to go start 10 more companies, but I can't. And so this is kind of my way of indulging in that. Now, My Favorite Murder is another popular podcast. I think it's one of the very top podcasts. And again, my description of it is true crime comedy for women looking to relax. And so these are lengthier episodes. It's more directed at women. It has a huge female listenership. And I think in this case, you're not really tailoring this to someone consistently on the go, but more so, maybe someone's relaxing on the couch in the afternoon. Maybe someone's just doing some vacuuming, but they're just looking to fit a piece of audio or content in between. They're not looking to be so stimulated where they need to think about something in particular, but they are enjoying the experience of listening to this podcast. So I would encourage you, if you are thinking through a podcast, to go through this exercise of layering on this concept of how is someone engaging with this? How is this fitting into their life in this passive listening sense? Now, if you're also thinking about what should I even talk about in the first place? What should my podcast be about? You're going to want to go through some of the same exercises as thinking through whatever your newsletter should be about. And it's starting with your obsessions and working backwards. So if you remember, my advice to people was to ask questions like, what do you think about in the shower? Or what do you know that 95% of the population doesn't know, or 99% even? Now, in addition to those questions and starting with your obsessions, there are some additional podcast questions that I think matter. The first one is, does the subject have longevity? And what I mean by that is, if you have an idea for a blog post, you can write that blog post and it can stand alone and be pretty unrelated to the other things that you write about. If you are starting a podcast, there realistically needs to be some sort of theme or something that people depend on to some degree. And so, does your topic or whatever you think you want to talk about on your podcast, does it have some sort of longevity? In addition to that, is this something that people would want to listen to for 10 minutes, an hour, 3 hours? Some podcasts are truly 3 hours. And the reason I'm asking this is not because there is a correct answer, but rather because this is something you should think about as it relates to your format, right? Is this the type of thing that should be a short form podcast or a long form podcast? Most people opt towards a few podcast types, a few podcast lengths, a few podcast structures, but that doesn't mean that you should as well. Similarly, a lot of people just lean towards a completely ongoing podcast that never ends. Well, if you're focusing on a particular topic, do you truly have enough content for a full season or more? If you do, great. If not, consider having, a very segmented, very clear-cut season of perhaps 6 episodes. But think about these things as you're thinking through your podcast structure, and don't just opt towards the same podcast structure that everyone else does. And then tied to these things, and something that I mentioned before, question, is there a new format that would be appropriate for this purpose? So try to think outside the box. If we just quickly go back to one of the prior slides where I talk through all of the different types of video content that exists today that doesn't quite exist with podcasts or audio, well, I think it will. I do think you're going to have more so audio blogs or vlogs coming up. I think there's going to be different podcast types that I can't even dream up today. So don't feel trapped by the existing podcast types. Speaking of the podcast types, though, if you are looking to think through which ones already exist, which ones are popular, here are some of the most popular podcast types. So interview style is the one I'm most familiar with. I think many of you are. An example of that is Indie Hackers. So that is when you bring on guests and you interview them about their expertise or some subject in particular. Solo, pretty straightforward. It's one person, similar to what I'm doing right now, talking about a subject. It can be difficult to keep up the energy, to have enough things to say, but it can work. And an example of that is Hardcore History. There are fiction podcasts. So one of them is Blackout, but there are many other fiction podcasts which are not focused on a particular subject matter, but really a story. There's also nonfiction storytelling. So Reply All is one that I really like. And they have podcast episodes about anything from QAnon to blockchain to many other things. Like actually, I'm sure many of you have heard of their episode on Indian call centers. So another podcast type is nonfiction storytelling. Another one is conversational. So if you've heard the All In podcast, it's a relatively new podcast that has really taken off. One thing, just to kind of double down on some of the things I said, this is a great example of a podcast that has taken off due to the existing audience of the people who created the podcast. But conversational is pretty straightforward. It's people talking between one another. And then there's hybrid podcasts, which are, as it sounds, a hybrid of some of the existing infrastructure. So for example, My First Million is one of those where you kind of have an element of nonfiction storytelling. You also, sometimes they bring on interview or people to interview. You also have a very conversational element to it. So this is really what I mean by be creative. Hybrid can really open up your ability to create a much more interesting podcast than some of these very discrete types that exist today. And then finally, I wanted to add one more on, which I'm just calling here repurposed. And all that means is you have some existing content out there today, and you are reading that content or repurposing it for audio. And for example, Ben Thompson at Stratechery does this, where he basically just reads out his newsletter for people who prefer audio relative to reading. Some other things to keep in mind is on top of the common podcast types, you can layer on variations. So there's long form podcasts and there's short form podcasts. There's capped series, as we've talked about. So something that only has a rigid number of episodes and it's done after that, or ongoing. And so there are examples all over this page of the different types of podcasts. And I really encourage you to be creative and not just follow the streamlined interview style podcast that I think is, in my experience, the most common. Now, choosing a format, I've seen many articles because I was doing research for these sessions, and there are many different things to keep in mind. And it's not that you should ignore them here, but there are many articles that will say, okay, well, this one type of podcast is easier to create, right? Or a solo podcast you can control to a larger degree. Conversational podcast tends to have more entertainment value. Certain podcasts require more editing versus others don't. Certain ones require a higher budget. There are all types of things to certainly factor in, right? So I'm not saying ignore these things, but ultimately, if you are thinking through what format you should be choosing, I think you really need to bring yourself back to the original question that I mentioned at the beginning of this session, which is really, what is your goal here, right? So were you trying to convey a new idea? Were you trying to build your network? Were you trying to increase your MRR? So remembering that goal, and then also remembering, tied to that goal, what value you're trying to create for the audience. And ultimately, whatever format you choose there should relate to those goals, right? So what format allows me to communicate the value that I'm trying to convey the best? And this is, there's a typo on the slide, but really, yeah, what allows me to communicate the value I'm trying to convey the best? And so as an example, and sorry, I'm a little sick right now, but if you're trying to build your personal brand, perhaps a solo or conversational podcast most effectively allows you to achieve that. If you are looking to teach a particular skill, perhaps nonfiction storytelling may be most appropriate. If you're looking to grow your network, perhaps interview style may be the best for you. Now, if you're really unsure and you're like, Steph, I don't know, I have these ideas and this is my goals, but I don't really know which one will allow me to do this the best. Well, one thing that you can do, but I don't think you need to do, is look at the existing podcasts in your genre. So if you're creating a business podcast, go look at the top business podcasts and see what works for that type of podcast, and or really what format works for that industry of podcasts. And that will give you an indicator. But really, I think you should be asking the question of, what am I really trying to build here? What value am I trying to create for my audience? And how do I do that most effectively? What type of style of podcast allows me to create the most value? And in going through that exercise, and I'll keep saying it throughout this conversation because I think it's really important, is just be creative. Do not feel the need to just duplicate what already exists out there. So I'm going to give you a personal example. I mentioned that I'm planning on launching a podcast. There are many things still in progress. Perhaps it'll never actually end up happening. But my personal example, to give you something concrete, which I think is important, is going through some of these questions or steps that I already mentioned. So the first is, what was my goal? Well, my goal really was to establish my expertise in a particular space, and that was really amongst business builders or marketers or operators. Okay, great. That's my goal. It's very clear. There are other things that I may get from building a podcast, but that is my core primary goal. Okay, so based on that, I think through what my kind of personal monopoly, or what do I think about in the shower, or what do I talk about? What do I know that perhaps some people don't know about? And I came to this basic idea of a podcast illustrating how companies make money in non-obvious ways. In this particular case, this actually came from a tweet that I did around a month ago. And I tweeted about how in my opinion, the best way to get an MBA in 2021 was opening up your phone, picking an app, learning how it makes money, and then repeating that process. And then when I realized that some people didn't recognize how many ways there were to make money in this world, I did a thread on that. And both of those tweets got a lot of engagement. And to me, that was a little bit of an indicator of there's something here. And we'll talk about growth and all that validation later. But that's where I got the basic idea. Now, in addition to some of the things that I've already mentioned, one question I encourage you to ask is why audio, right? So we talked about so many different mediums. Why audio? Why not video? Why not a book? Why not a presentation? Why not a radio show? Why audio? Or rather, I should say, why podcasting? And in this case, a podcast would allow me to talk through examples with more nuance and also capture more of the mind share of busy marketers or operators, similar to what I mentioned from My First Million, where these people don't have the time to read very, very lengthy case studies about many different companies. Maybe they do, but not all of them do. And so audio allows me to penetrate part of that mind share through passive listening. So to me, okay, I have a reason as to why I'm doing audio past just everyone is doing audio. All right, moving on. We have the what, for who, and when statement. For me, this was business breakdowns from marketers and operators looking to get their wheels spinning in their free time, right? So this actually has some parallels to My First Million, but I can actually identify very clearly what this is, for who, and how they would engage with this. What would they be doing if they're actually engaging with this podcast? Now, the format for me, at least at this moment, and this might change, we'll talk about iterating in the next section, but is a hybrid model. And the reason for this is it allows me to, again, what are my goals? What am I really trying to translate with this idea? And for me, it was the combination of nonfiction storytelling. So, really being able to break down a model and say what it is, how it works, why it's effective, and then take a second half, which is more exploratory and conversational, that thinks through how that can be reapplied. Now, finally, the additional thing that I think I highlighted here is the differentiator. And this relates to really what we've talked about throughout doing content right entirely. And why should I create this idea? What is my unique differentiator? And in this case, the differentiator of this podcast is hopefully, if done correctly, is my ability to bring unobvious being the adjective, the key here, unobvious business models to the forefront and apply them to everyday businesses. So that's my personal example. And you can kind of take the same template and go through the same concept. And this is in no way going to guarantee if this will work. But what it will do is help you think through why are you even doing this in the first place, setting yourself up for a more likely case of success. Now, if you've got through this entire section, I do have one more slide that I wanted to go through before we dive into session 3, which is all about growth. And that is podcast creation. So with anything, there's kind of like an 80-20 that you can do, the Pareto principle. And in this case, I already mentioned at the beginning, I'm not going to talk through exactly how to create a podcast and exactly what software or hardware to use. But there are some things that may be helpful, right? And just to kind of double down on this idea that the hardware and software doesn't necessarily matter, no one knows what microphone Tim Ferriss or Michelle Obama is using, right? The same way when you go to a website or use an app, you don't know their tech stack, right? So don't stress too much about those. I do have a link where Justin Jackson from Transistor has a good overview of some of these elements, but outside of some of that nitty-gritty stuff, I did want to talk through a handful of things that I think will be helpful if you are in the mode where you've already thought through why you're doing a podcast, what you want it to be, and you're in the nitty-gritty of creating it. So the first piece of advice is treat your podcast like a business, right? I all too often see that people start a podcast and really it's a light switch, right? Where one day they didn't have a podcast and the next day they have it. And from then on, whatever idea they had at the beginning remains the concept into perpetuity. And what I'm really vouching for is this idea of creating an MVP, learning and iterating on it, and not being so rigid in just saying, I had this idea for a podcast and it's interview style, and I'm on my 80th episode and things aren't going well, and I'm wondering why, right? So we're going to talk more about this in the next section, but I think that's really important. The second is entering any podcast episode, regardless of the format that you choose, regardless of what your podcast is about. Make sure you are able to answer the question, what do I hope that someone takes away from a particular podcast? So for example, if you are doing an interview style podcast, what in particular are you hoping the guest will share as a piece of their expertise? Just make sure you have clarity as to what you actually hope people will take away, because if you don't have that clarity, it's more likely that someone will listen to part or a full episode and not really feel like they got much value. And guess what? When people don't get value, they stop listening. The third thing is, if you do choose to go with an interview style podcast, do not just interview people who happen to have clout. Of course, this is a short-term growth hack where if someone has clout and they happen to share the interview, this gives you more likely the possibility of that person's audience becoming your audience. There's nothing wrong with choosing people with large audiences, but just keep in mind that if you do that, make sure you can answer the question I just mentioned of what do you hope your audience will get from this person. If you can't understand that or really articulate that effectively, then really this is a short-term growth hack, and it's not really going to help your success, because ultimately the success of your podcast will come from really great content being created. The next thing is listen to your own videos or your audio segments before actually airing them, right? And so if you record a podcast and you listen to it and you're bored, other people will be bored too. So if it's not good, do not air it. That's another thing that I see people do, where they will record something. Once they have recorded it, they will feel like at that point they've invested the time to create this thing, they might as well air it. Your podcast feed is just like your newsletter feed or your blog feed. If you wrote a half-baked article, would you publish it? Probably not. So the same thing is true with podcasting. Only publish when you're really, really proud, because long-term thinking is just as important with audio as it is with other mediums. The next thing is there's so much hardware and software available. Again, if you're interested in the deck, Justin Jackson gives a great overview and I've linked to it. But again, saying a specific mic is essential is like saying that to be a successful writer, you need the perfect text editor. So do not spend too much time on this. On a related note, as you are producing your podcast, outsource editing if you can, and really outsource anything that doesn't really relate to the core creative process that you as a creator are engaging in. So you can focus on creating and then outsource anything that falls outside of that. If that's not an option, because I obviously recognize that there are finances or expenses associated with outsourcing anything, then in particular with editing, Descript is a really great platform where you can really streamline what you're doing on the editing side and limit it. The reason I'm calling this out in particular, as in trying to outsource things, is I know people who have started podcasts, and let's say they've spent 2 hours preparing for a podcast, an hour recording it, and then they will spend hours, many, many hours actually editing the podcast. And that is not their expertise. It is not a candidly great use of their time. And they could reallocate that time to creating better episodes and growing their podcast more effectively. And then the final thing is, as you create a podcast, do create a recognizable intro. So the same way that you adhere to certain newsletters because you like the way that someone, the format of it, or the way that someone greets you every time they end up in your inbox, create a recognizable intro. And you can use Fiverr or other platforms similar to Fiverr to actually find those artists, and it's not as expensive as you think. But those little things actually do make a difference, and a lot of my favorite podcasts have excellent intros. I mentioned some of them. Robin Hood Snacks has one. The All In Pod has one. My First Million has one. So do invest in that if you do have the budget available. But overall, those were just some very, very, very few tips really in podcast creation, because as I mentioned, at the end of the day, a podcast will succeed or not succeed based on the content. and how good it is, not necessarily based on your ability to edit it perfectly or your ability to, have the perfect microphone. So I hope that was helpful. In the next section that we will go into is probably the one that people are most interested in, and it's how to grow and distribute your podcast. And I'm calling it Chapter 3, Land and Expand. So we will get to that very shortly, but I hope you enjoyed the second section, and I hope that you do go through some of those exercises where you think through why you're starting a podcast, what you're hoping to achieve, what the best format to actually achieve that is. And I really hope this was helpful.